So there's this book that I've been manifesting and hunting for years, and I finally found it. I'll get to that one first, probably. It's a rare find. It retails for crazy numbers every time I check on eBay. It's like upwards of 1,000, and I don't know, somehow I was able to find it, and I feel incredibly lucky for that. And I found it at a used bookstore, of all places. So I will start by showing you guys that one. But before I get to it, here's your warning. We definitely have a lot of ground to cover, as you could kind of see, but I promise you it is so worth sticking around for. I feel like there's such a range of classics and contemporary literature. I also have some philosophy books, so if you're into that sort of thing, I recommend staying. Also, to preface, I'm not usually someone that amasses such large quantities of books like you see here, despite the piles that you can see behind me and in front of me, which you can't really see much of. I know that these contrast with what I'm saying, but they're years worth of collecting. I actually very rarely buy new books too, unless it's a new release that I really want to read. I bought Rouge by Mona Awad around the end of 2023, and I'm pretty sure that's the last new book that I've gotten. But anyways, half of these books were purchased at a used bookstore in Chicago where I'm based, and they were having a half off sale on top of that. So most of these ended up costing like $2, which is insane. And I woke up so early to get there as soon as they opened, and already there was just like so many people throwing books in their baskets, which is a nice sight to just be like surrounded by other readers who were just excited as me to get their hands on them. But it was a little bit off-putting too, because it's not something that you see every day. And then the second half of these books were from a bookstore that was closing outside of the city, and their whole shop was literally everything was 75% off, which is so crazy to me because to me, they're all worth so much more. And the people at the bookstore at the closing sale, they were even crazier than the first group. I'll see if I could add in some footage of the shelves and how they looked afterward. It always makes me kind of sad when closing sales go so well for bookstores because the readers were there the whole time. And I don't know, it's just unfortunate when another local bookstore closes. Like if you're also from Chicago and you've seen the new Barnes & Noble that opened up in Wicker Park in that historic bank building, what do you think of that? Because I'm honestly split on that. I'm glad that the building itself is preserved and it wasn't torn down or anything, but there's just so many great local bookstores on that block. It seemed kind of unnecessary to threaten the sales of small businesses with such a big chain opening. But anyways, I don't even know what I'm talking about anymore. Let's just get into these books. We have so many to go through. Okay, guess the first book, because I know, this is Ariel, Poems by Sylvia Plath, the fourth printing, printed in 1965. This was back when they would list all of the other authors that they were publishing at the time on the backside of their books. So like T.S. Eliot and James Joyce. It also says Faber and Faber published books by the following authors. And then it's like their top 20 highlighted, basically. It's like Penguin or Scholastic were trying to convince us that they're respectable publishers, despite who they are. But anyways, this is the type of book or the type of item that you go on eBay to look for. And sometimes you find it and you save it, but you never buy it because it's just way too crazy expensive. And this one retails for over 1,000 because this is a first printing. I'm not going to sell it though, unless it becomes out of necessity, of course, but I'm cherishing this one forever. And if you're a reader of Sylvia Plath, if she's a favorite of yours, you can understand, I hope, when I say that I had to hold back tears or emotion at least when I found this. I just can't believe that no one else saw it, you know? From all the people that were there at the bookstore and at the sale, you would think that someone would see it. But it's crazy how it wasn't even like displayed prominently. I've also been thinking about doing a standalone video about Sylvia Plath. It's just one of those things where I feel like it's only if I have an interesting take or an interesting angle, an idea that isn't already out there to talk about. But if I think of something, I'll definitely do a video and I'll feature this one and talk about more about why it's such an exciting read. And it's such an exciting find too. I might get a little display case for it before the little corners are ruined. This one unfortunately had like a little tear at the top, but it's still perfect to me. It just adds character, you know? And it's just crazy to think that this was preserved so well from it being from 1965. Insane. Love it. Okay, so I was excited about finding this one. This is Seinfeld and Philosophy, a book about everything and nothing, edited by William Irvin, who is a professor at King's College. So Seinfeld is 100% my favorite comfort show, even though I promise I'm not someone that makes a habit of complaining about every little thing in everyday life. But there has been multiple people and multiple instances now where someone would stop me in the middle of a conversation and point out how odd that their conversation with me feels plucked out of an episode of it. But I kind of get it though. There's a lot of comfort in finding the trivial issues in the mundanity of life or the stresses of life when it gets hard. And I guess sometimes choosing to focus on the little issues can be a way to cope. Maybe that's what this book is about. I only read a couple pages of it, but there's a bold comparison that's made in the first page about Jerry being based on Socrates. So already I'm intrigued to read the rest because that's kind of a wild comparison, but also I kind of get it. Here's another philosophy book. I honestly just got it for the cover. Look how beautiful that is. Actually, it's more of a dictionary. It's the Harper Collins Dictionary on Philosophy, an in-depth explanation and examples covering over 3,000 entries. And it's written by Peter Angelis. As a reference, this is amazing as a starting point. A lot of the times I'm in a general mood to do some research on ways on thinking and philosophies, but with over 3,000 topics here, I basically have enough to entertain myself for a lifetime. So 5 stars without reading it, to be honest. I really just like the way that it describes it on the backside though, which is the reason why I picked it up. But it reads, the students of philosophy often feel bewildered by the vast terminology of the subject. The Harper Collins Dictionary of Philosophy helps lessen the confusion by providing a single source of clear and understandable definitions of philosophical terms. Emphasis is on the areas most commonly covered in introductory philosophy courses: epistemology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, and the philosophies of religion and politics. Here's another one that I picked up more as a reference than anything, and that's Stephen King's On Writing. Essentially, it's a part memoir, part class about his views on crafting the best novel. I've actually never read any of his books. To be fully transparent, I just can't really handle horror, if I'm honest. Never could. But the reason I picked this one up is since I'm in the process of writing my first novel this year, and I'm about 6 chapters in, and there's elements of suspense and more so psychological fear, which is something that I'm sure I could learn a lot from with this book, since he's kind of the expert on this topic. Also, let me know if I should do a video on my novel drafting and writing. I just think it would be really fun to just soundboard my ideas and hint little bits about the plot, because I'm just really happy with how it's coming out so far. But I haven't shared a lot about it yet with friends or family, and let alone on here. So let me know. I feel like I should section the rest of these books off to give it a little bit more structure. So here we have all the Penguin classics that I was able to find, which was very hard, especially at the first bookstore that was closing. Even when the books were just 10% off, a lot of these were already gone, which is awesome though. There's definitely been such an increase in interest in books. But anyways, I was able to find some really, really good ones. And first we have The Beggar's Opera by John Gay, which is a 3-part play that's supposed to be a political satire and one of the earliest examples of musical theater. I've actually never read anything from him, so I'm just really intrigued from what I've read up on it, but let me know what you know about it. Kind of the same idea with this next one. This is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's selected poems, and I haven't read anything from him either. These are a collection of his selected poems, and since I don't have a lot of knowledge in the realm of poetry either, it's definitely a goal of mine to delve more into different prose and short stories and poetic words. But I always find it odd how much poetry I've yet to consume, seeing as though I'm someone that loves poetic lines in novels and very long, winding, beautiful sentences. And from what the summary says, it quotes, "No one can fully comprehend the literary culture of 19th century America without coming to terms with Longfellow's work." So I'm deeming this one as essential. Naturally, right? I also picked up Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is such a must-have just because it's one of the earliest works of feminist philosophy, and it laid out this very clear argument for women's rights. I just think it'll be interesting to see it from the roots of where feminism kind of started, and even though so much has happened since then, to see what feminism meant back in 1792 can still give some perspective on today. Here's one that just kind of caught me because of the title, and that's A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. It's, as it says in the summary, the most reliable and comprehensive account of the Great Plague that we possess. It's essentially a fictive journal based on real historical accounts, essentially, where Defoe writes about the Great Plague of London. And I think what's super interesting is how this is the existing document that we have that's the most reliable, like it says. But during the time that it happened, he was 5 years old, and he wasn't even in the center of the plague when it went on. And it just kind of makes me think about how this is something that affected London for decades to come, obviously, but also for it to become such a deep interest for him to write about it instead of someone that actually went through it. It just makes you think. I promise this is the last book with a heavy topic, but this one's pretty similar to the last one, and that is a short account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas. It's a very strong criticism against the destruction of the Spanish colonialism in the New World, and a very detailed account on what the Native community faced during this time. And it's more of like a documentary type of historical reference because he actually experienced it firsthand. And for a while, he was also a part of that destruction before coming to terms that what he was doing was unquestionably morally wrong. And this is just kind of something that I've been trying to get into a little bit more. A lot of the things that I tend to read are just purely fiction, but there's something interesting about melding some elements of fiction and storytelling to make nonfiction more interesting, more digestible for people to essentially understand the real meaning behind this book. Because a lot of these delve into very serious historical topics, and I've heard a lot of great things about this author. So it'll be the first of him that I read. Here's something more lighthearted though, and that's Arms and the Man by Bernard Shaw, which is a comedic play that criticizes how people romanticize the trope of men going to war and having this beautiful woman who cries over him at home and pines for him to come back. Also always felt a little bit weird about this being such an overused trope. Something so serious and disastrous as war, and to create so many picturesque versions of that experience can be kind of painful and life-altering for families. So it never really sat right with me, but it'll be interesting to see how he uses sarcasm to make that social commentary and essentially get his point across in a more digestible way, in a more funny way, probably. Here's the last one I have, not of the classics, but at least of the Penguin classics, and that is Dubliners by James Joyce. It's essentially a collection of short stories that talk about the people of Dublin during the early 20th century in a really realistic way. From what I've heard, it's supposed to feel like a microcosm of the human experience, which I think is so fitting for him to write about as a topic from what I know and other works that I've read from him, like A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. It's essentially about understanding yourself, but that one being more in the autobiographical sense. So I picked this one up just because I was more interested in seeing how he wrote about the experiences of others rather than introspection and his own personal experiences. Okay, so let's step out of the classics for a good while. So I've kind of haphazardly organized these by time period from 1900 to present, and there might be some mistakes to the timeline. Actually, no, there definitely are, but I tried. But first, I have A Terribly Serious Adventure, Philosophy and War at Oxford from 1900 to 1960, because we already know there was so much drama that must have gone on during this time. But even in the summary, it already got my attention. It says, a lively, immersive account of the brilliant and colorful philosophers who roamed the halls of mid-20th century Oxford and taught the world the importance of language. What are the limits of language? How can philosophy be brought closer to everyday life? What is a good human being? A Terribly Serious Adventure traces the friendships and rivalries, the shared preoccupations, and the passionate disagreements of some of University of Oxford's most innovative thinkers. I think as of now, this one's at the top of my list to read next. It kind of reminds me of other writers that happen to go to university together, like Donna Tartt and Bret Easton Ellis, and how their stories ended up being such opposite sides of the same coin. So if this is anything reminiscent of that, I'm already sold on this one. I also picked up Crossing California by Adam Langer, which I had to look online for a summary. I more so just had these reviews on the backside that intrigued me enough to pick it up. But it's essentially a story about Chicago and the neighborhood of Rogers Park during the 70s and 80s. And as someone that's from Chicago, I always just want to learn anything and everything about our city's history. And this one focuses on the lives of 3 Jewish families and their lives during this time. And there's also a nod to California Avenue as the title. Aside from it being a literal reference to the street, I think it also ties into how divided the city of Chicago was, and honestly still is, in terms of division of community when it comes to social and economical divides. I'm just really intrigued to read what the city was in their eyes during this time, and also during the time where my parents were living in Chicago when they were children. I managed to find a Murakami book in the madness of all the books being sifted through, and from what I've heard, I think I found a really good one, and that's After the Quake. I actually just finished Norwegian Wood, which is the first book of his that I've read. And for some reason, I put it in my head that reading Murakami was difficult. I'm not sure where I got that from, but now I just want to read anything that he's written. And I do want to say I understand that the way that he describes women is very questionable at best. And there's a lot of commentary about understanding the time period that he was living through to lend to his writing. And we have to kind of remember that these aren't the opinions of the author, but the opinions of his fictive characters. But still, I'm kind of torn on this. And more so, I'm just in it for the story and for the plot lines. And I think the seriousness of the plots are especially true in a story like this one, where it talks about the 1996 Kobe earthquake through short stories and accounts and what followed. It's definitely really different from the context and content of Norwegian Wood and following personal relationships, and this one being more about a historical account. So I'm intrigued just to see how he handles the topic, and hopefully he handles the seriousness of it with care and accuracy. Susan Sontag, also hidden in the back of the shelves, I think most likely because of the cover. It looks really unassuming that I probably would have missed it too. But I'm one of those people that walks down the book aisles with my head turned 90 degrees, and I don't have any shame about it. I probably look crazy, but see, that's how I found this one. I feel like this is going to contrast a lot with the book that I have read from her, which is On Women, and this one's more of a historical fiction piece by her instead of the essay style. This one is about a complex love story set in Naples, Italy, and a volcano that's at the center of it. And it serves as this real possibility of something that can erupt at any moment, and also it's a symbol of their relationship between the characters being eruptible at any moment too. So it was definitely her name that holds weight that made me pick it up, but also the premise. So I'm very interested in reading this. If you've read it before, let me know what you thought of it. I haven't actually heard of this before finding it at the bookstore, and I didn't really read any reviews before talking about it. So let me know if you liked it. So I guess we're just going to add to the all-star cast. This one is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. It was her first novel, and I haven't read it yet, so it's probably time that I do. Because I love Sula, and I loved Beloved. And from the important themes that she writes about when it comes to race and identity, and she kind of just writes in the best prose in my perspective. I'm kind of just going to go into this not even knowing much about what it's about. I'll just trust that I'll be left with this lingering feeling of contemplation when I'm done with it, like I have with her other two works. Here's one that I wasn't familiar with both the book and the author, but the summary sold me on it, and that's Supper Club by Laura Williams. So I'll just read the summary to you. Roberta spends much of her time trying not to take up space. At almost 30, she is adrift and alienated from life, stuck in a mindless job. But when she meets Stevie, a spirited and effervescent artist, their intense friendship sparks a change in Roberta, a shift in her desire for more. Together they invent the Supper Club, a transgressive and joyous collective of women who celebrate rather than admonish their hungers. They gather after dark and feast until they're sick. They break into private buildings and leave carnage in their wake. They embrace their changing bodies. They stop apologizing. For these women, the club is a way to explore, discover, and push the boundaries of the space that they take up in the world and reclaim it. Devastatingly perceptive and savagely funny, Supper Club is an essential coming-of-age story from our time. To give a little hint about the novel that I'm working on, probably the first detail that I've ever said out loud, but a central element to the story is this art collective that slowly and then kind of all at once becomes very destructive and problematic to themselves is a really big part of it. So seeing a completely different take using this story element is going to be really interesting to read about. So I'm looking forward to reading more about that. Next up, another new discovery for me. It's The Fun Stuff and Other Essays by James Wood, who I learned is a leading literary critic. I feel like I should have known that, but I didn't. But this is a zoom out look on what writing a novel is. And he looks at classics from Tolstoy and Hardy. But then he also references modern authors to come up with this really analytical summary on what literature in the modern day has kind of shaped up to be, and how all these historical influences has influenced what writing is now. I don't know, I just think as someone who equally goes back and forth between classic and contemporary literature, it's going to be a very informative read. How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water by Angie Cruz. I've been meaning to pick this one up for a while, actually, mostly for its relevance to today's issues, because even though it's set during the Great Depression, it deals with gentrification and financial struggles of the lower class, which I feel like, if anything, it's even more so relevant now, as equally as it was back then. But here's a quick summary of it. Cara Romero thought that she would work at the factory of little lamps for the rest of her life. But when in her mid-50s she lost her job in the Great Recession, she's forced back into the job market for the first time in decades. Set up with a job counselor, Kara instead begins to narrate the story of her life. Over the course of 12 sessions, she recounts her love affairs, her alternately biting and loving relationships with her neighbor Lulu and her sister Angela, her struggles with debt, gentrification, and loss, and eventually what really happened between her and her estranged son Fernando. As Kara confronts her darkest secrets and regrets, we see a woman buffeted by life, but still full of fight. I keep saying top of the list to read to so many of these, which I know is inherently impossible, but still, this one is in the running. Here's one that I just felt compelled I needed to pick up off the title, but then especially on the premise, and that's A Horse Walks Into a Bar by David Grossman. Also, where are you guys on the aphantasia scale? Because I could just vividly picture this title. But anyways, let me just give you a little bit of a summary. Okay, so it says it's a searing short novel about the life of a stand-up comic as revealed in the course of one evening's performance. In the dance between comic and audience, with barbs flying back and forth, a deeper story begins to take shape, one that will alter the lives of many of those in attendance. Already promises to be non-traditional, because this whole thing is set in one stand-up comic set, which is, like 1 hour, and it's the winner of the Man Booker International Prize. So I can only imagine that this is going to be a great study on dialogue and humor. I also picked up Tomb Sweeping by Alexandra Chang, which is kind of reminiscent of the themes in the novel by Angie Cruz, where it's a book that deals with identity and the working class. And in this novel, it's explored through the eyes of immigrant families. As it says in the synopsis, it probes the loyalties that we hold to relatives, to strangers, and to ourselves. In stories set across the US and in Asia, Alexandra Chang immerses us in the lives of immigrant families, grocery store employees, expecting parents, and guileless lab assistants. A woman known only to her neighbors as the Asian recycling lady collects bottles from the streets that she calls home. An unfulfilled housewife in Shanghai finds a secret outlet for her ambitions in an undercover gambling den. Two strangers become something more through the bond of mistaken identity. Adeptly attuned to the mystery of living, Tomb Sweeping invites us to consider whether one person can ever entirely do right by another. I'm just so excited to kind of have expanded my reading this year, and I'm trying to find more stories in particular about experiences of immigrants and citizens of the US and all backgrounds, especially in modern times, anywhere from the 90s to present day, and just learning about their experiences, just because I think it's so important to kind of stay informed and continue to understand each other's individual struggles. And I think this one's going to do it really well in the eyes of Asian American culture. Here's one from outside of the States though, and that is Fruit of the Drunken Tree by Ingrid Rojas Contreras. Also, how pretty is this cover? This is Ingrid's first novel that quickly received a lot of praise. It's an autobiographical fiction set in Bottega, where there's this constant threat of kidnapping and unrest. And here's a little summary on this. Assassinations hover just outside her walls, where the godlike drug lord Pablo Escobar reigns, capturing the attention of the nation. Inspired by the author's own life, Fruit of the Drunken Tree is a powerful testament to the impossible choices that women are often forced to make in the face of violence and the unexpected connections that can blossom out of desperation. So another powerful one that I'm really glad that I found. Next up, we have Sudden Death by Alvaro Enrique. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing this last name. I feel like I definitely am. But this book seems to be packed with everything that I love, and I think it speaks for itself. So considering that I have no background knowledge of this one, I'm just going to let the summary do the talking. A tennis match in 16th century Rome, Caravaggio plays against the Spanish poet Cadevo. Galileo is a line judge. The ball is made from the coveted hair of recently beheaded Anne Boleyn. There's fighting, drinking, sexual liaisons, popes behaving badly, executions, Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII plotting. There's murder and cheating. And across the ocean, conquistador Hernan Cortez and his Mayan translator and lover play their own games, a domestic comedy that will change the course of the world. There's more fighting, hallucinogenic mushrooms, more sex, utopian colonies, assassinations, and coronations. This is a story of revolutions, artistic, religious, political, personal, sexual. This story is a fiction and an archive and an oracle. History is a game. History is overturned. Game, set, match. Okay, so to round out this section of books, we have Swing Time by Zadie Smith. And I know that she's such a well-known author, and I can't believe how I haven't read any of her books yet. But now that I found this copy, I'm kind of curious to see if this is the best one to start with. But Swing Time is about a broken friendship. It says two brown girls dream of being dancers, but only one, Tracy, has talent. The other has ideas about rhythm and time, about black bodies and black music, what constitutes a tribe or makes a person truly feel. It's a close but complicated childhood friendship that ends abruptly, never to be revisited, but never quite forgotten either. Tracy makes it to the chorus line but struggles with adult life, while her friend leaves the old neighborhood behind. The story moves from London to West Africa, where diaspora tourists travel back in time to find their roots. The women dance just like Tracy, the same twists, the same shakes, and the origins of a profound inequality are not a matter of distant history, but a present dance to the music of life. So, even though I'm following this up with more classic books, I'm so glad that I've been veering into books that talk about issues that are very relevant in society today. And I think this one really captures what direction that I hope to explore more for a while. Okay, so before we get to the scary looming pile of the rest of the classics, I have a couple of philosophy books to kind of round out the list. And these realistically won't be my first reads, most of them actually. But first off, let's start with the big one, The Essential Plato. Everything that a person could want is all right here. It's more of a coffee table book, 100%, but it's the only one on this list that'll serve that purpose, I promise. No, but realistically, I'm not going to be treating it like a novel, but more just like of a reference. But it does look kind of impressive to the unassuming eye, right? There's one that alone I think you should see as a red flag. But in a collection, I think that it's fine, and that's Machiavelli. This one gives a brief insight to his three major works, which is The Prince, Discourses, and The History of Florence. I think, again, it's one of those like nice references to have, but this one's a lot more condensed, so I will be reading this one. Remind me to take the sticker off of this one. It's kind of bothering me, but it's impossible to take it off. But anyways, I think that this one is definitely counts as philosophy, and that's Why Vegan by Peter Singer. Fun fact, I've been vegan for 8 years now, going on 9, and I have a small little collection on the vegan argument. So Peter Singer is one of the most known vegan spokespeople in modern writing, and I just like having these small, concise, to the point reads, because to me it's more of a nice reminder of why I chose to go vegan, which for me was solely on animal rights and environmental reasons. I'm what you call like a junk food vegan, and I need to get better about what I eat and eating more balanced meals instead of just snacking all day. But I felt the need to say that because a lot of people are really pushy in veganism, and I'm not that way. I kind of say follow your own moral compass, 100%. I found this next one, Shopping with Fruit by Rachel Bowlby. It's about understanding what consumerism is, like what is it at the core of it. I'll just read off the summary for this one because that's what really struck me to buying it. Shopping with Fruit looks at some of the surprising ways in which the consumer subject appears in a range of writings, from literature to marketing, psychology, and psychoanalysis. Rachel Bowlby shows how ideas about consumption are brought to bear on contemporary questions of choice in areas that seem far removed from straightforward matter of shopping. She also shows that arguments and assumptions about the psychology of consumers themselves throw light on general questions of human psychology. I'm someone who's just really interested in the idea of dead malls, and the few times that I've been able to explore them before they get torn down and just getting to walk through the same mall hallways that at one point had so many people shopping and hanging out during the 90s and early 2000s. And just flash forward to now, consumerism is just so rapidly changing from away from physical stores, which is so sad to me, but to be able to put this feeling of sadness for the loss of that social aspect of shopping is, I think, what drew me to this one. Okay, so our last mini philosophy book we have is Growing Up Absurd by Paul Goodman. It's a critique on the way that youth are treated in modern capitalist society. And even though this one was written in the 60s, the ideas in his examinations are still super relevant today. I really like how this review summed it up. Paul Goodman's Growing Up Absurd is an extraordinarily good and important book, the best book I know on the subject of youth. Goodman is a serious, profound, and old-fashioned moral book. With great originality and lucidity, he argues that the organization man, the beast, and the juvenile delinquent are merely reactions to the same basic problems. I think this is all just really more relevant today, where each generation feels like it's veering one step away from developing their own creativity and individuality. I mean, look at AI, right? But I think that's kind of its own separate video in itself. Alright, so I also picked up 2 art books. This first one is a collection of works by Edgar Degas, which is one of my favorite French Impressionists. And for a little bit, I was kind of confused as to why This one was actually in the rare book section. It just kind of seemed like any other art book. It wasn't like a taschen, anything specific. But when I opened it, I found a letter on the inside, which then I found out was to an artist who was gifted the book because her sculpture was put in a gallery next to a sculpture made by Degas. So they kind of gifted them the book to say, like, this is a predecessor. Here you go. You're now within the ranks of these people. So I'm thinking, okay, whoever was gifted this book is kind of up there. And I guess they're so up there that they forgot their letter. First of all, the letterhead, Yale University Art Gallery. I'm not going to make this up. Here's a signature down here. So this is from 2003. So chances are that the person that wrote this letter is not in charge of this department anymore. Or it could be, you never know. I would read you this letter, but it seems like the director of the gallery had a really close connection to the artist. But they talk about skiing together and going on lavish vacations to Aspen, and they reference the term summer neighbors. That's a new one for me. But anyways, they also provide like information about where her sculpture was going to be placed. And essentially, it looks like it was going to be in the middle of Henri Matisse and Max Ernst. Who else do I know? Others who I'm sure if I knew more about sculptures, I would be fully impressed. So this is amazing in and of itself. I mean, this was $3, right? But it's priceless. And then I also picked up this gorgeous, wonderful, amazing, all the positive descriptive words, coffee book about Harold Lloyd, master comedian. Accurate, very accurate. When it comes to silent films, it's a tough choice between choosing him or Charlie Chaplin, but Lloyd's style always kind of spoke to me. Like, his acting always felt more personable and almost like relatable, but it also had like this aura of like sophistication that I was really drawn to. And the confidence in his filmmaking was really apparent in a lot of his work. Also, I've been thinking about getting a print of the glass scene from Safety Last. So as soon as I saw this as the cover on top of that, I mean, an amazing 10 out of 10. Need to have it immediately. You know when they say who was your first crush in media, like as a kid, and they always say like some cartoon character? For me, that was him. Something to do with his glasses, I'm sure. So cute. Okay, here's a couple more that I got in no particular category this time. First off, we have Sifting Through the Madness for the Word, the Line, the Way by Charles Bukowski. Like I mentioned before, I really just want to make an effort to expand my reading this year, and a part of that is delving into more in the realm of poetry. And I feel like it's only fitting to start with one of the best known in terms of contemporary writers of poetry. He has a very large body of work, actually. I was just reading up on him earlier, but he had, I think, about published 45 books of poetry or more in his lifetime. That's not my motivation to write my novel. I don't know what is. I also picked up this one, the Puttermesser Papers by Cynthia Ozick. Another one that I got just because of the premise, and I'll read the full summary for this one. Ruth Puttermesser lives in New York City. Her learning is monumental. Her love life is minimal. She prefers pouring through Plato to romping with married Morris Rappert. And her fantasies have a disconcerting tendency to come true, with disastrous consequences for what we laughably call reality. Puttermesser yearns for a daughter and promptly creates one, unassisted, in the form of the first recorded female golem. Laboring in the dusty crevices of the civil service, she dreams of reforming the city and manages to get herself elected as mayor. Puttermesser contemplates the afterlife and is hurtled into the headlong, only to discover that paradise found is also paradise lost. Overflowing with ideas, lambent with wit, the Puttermesser Papers is a tour de force by one of our most visionary novelists. I mean, New York City, references to Plato, a woman becoming mayor. I was already sold on this one. Here's one that I got because of the cover and because of the title, and that's Habeas Corpus by Alan Bennett. It seems to be a very over-the-top play that's a social commentary on the absurdities of legal systems imposing rules on sexuality and how weird it is that they feel the need to govern everyone's behavior. But it's basically a highly exaggerated take that uses humor to make a point to show how odd all of it is. That's another thing I'm excited to read more of, a lot of plays, and hopefully I'll review a little bit of those in the near future. Here's one that I picked up as a little treat for an old interest or fixation of mine, and that is Radium Girls by Kate Moore. I remember being so obsessed with learning everything and anything about Marie Curie when I was younger, and it's just so crazy to imagine these hundreds of women working full days in factories, and they're filled with radium and they're getting sick and they have no idea why. And that's why I got this book, because I think it's really overlooked as a part of history, and it's not really talked about as often, where radium was everywhere. It was in your makeup, the watches that they made, and it was used for medical purposes too. And it was just continuing to be used just to put money in the pockets of businesses that didn't really care about them. And it caused these women that worked with the substances on a daily basis to get really sick. So I think it's an important read. And from the reviews that I've read on Goodreads so far, it looks very, very promising. And then before I move on to some more classics, I have Hotel Splendid by Ludwig Bemelmans. And here's a summary for this one. Welcome to the Grand Hotel Splendid in 1920s New York, where hilarity and chaos reign. In the mirror-lined dining halls, the champagne is constantly flowing. In the kitchens downstairs, malcontent waiters incite revolution. In this classic memoir, Ludwig encounters eccentricity on every level of the hotel hierarchy as he works his way up from busboy at the restaurant's most undesirable table to assistant manager of the magnificent private banquets. There may be Russian ballerinas and Wall Street tycoons to entertain, but there is also the world's worst waiter to contend with. Accompanied by his own witty illustrations, this account of a bygone era of extravagance is also charming as it is righteously entertaining. This reminds me a lot of the book Martin Dressler by Stephen Milhauser, which I just referenced in my first video that I made, just because they're both about a man who climbs up the ranks in a hotel. At least premise-wise, they're similar. But this just seemed like a nice, relaxing read to contrast with a lot of the more heavily themed books in this list. So maybe if I'm in a panicky, anxiety-ridden mood, I'll probably pick this one up. Okay, big pile, but so many good finds here. I'm going to do a little bit of a speed run for some of these because I feel like I've been filming for over an hour at this point. So first we have two works by F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda. So we have Tales of the Jazz Age and The Last Tycoon. For the Love of the Last Tycoon. I made a video last week about what your favorite classic authors say about your personality, if you haven't checked that out. But I talked about how readers of Fitzgerald are such dreamers and they tend to have this idealized look on life, or they see everything from a romanticized lens. That's how I feel when I read his works. So I'm glad that I finally have these as physical copies. I read these a while ago, but I don't really remember them very fresh in my head. But here's one that I can't believe in all this time I still haven't read yet. And that's As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. I've heard it's one of the most accessible of his works and that this is a good one to start with. What I noticed until after I bought it is that it's actually only half the length of this book, and the rest of it's just background and it gives context. But it actually works out pretty good because it's the first one of his works that I'm reading. And also there's a lot of notes from the person who owned it before, which I personally love, but I know a lot of people kind of get irked that there's markings on the book, especially if they're not yours, but I think that it adds a little bit of character to it. I also picked up two works on Marcel Proust, the first being Finding Time Again, and then this is a collection of his personal letters. I always wonder with these types of letter collection types of works, did he know that they were going to be printed in the future? Like, I would imagine it would affect the content of what he writes if he knew that that was going to happen. Because if it was me, I'd be really upset with learning that knowledge. But apparently these letters are more selective, and they give a lot of insight on his thoughts on becoming a writer and his hesitation at the beginning at his ability to feel like he could actually make it a career. And it kind of just expands until the end where you can really see his confidence grow. At least that's what I got from the summary. I haven't read it yet, but I will. And I think that this novel really complements the book of letters because it's essentially a story about him discovering that to him, the meaning of life is to write his story and his memories. So it kind of becomes a full circle moment from the feelings of uneasiness seen in the letters to what comes of being this book. So I mentioned that the only book that I've read so far by James Joyce was A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, but I never had it as a physical copy, and I think I might get back to this one later once I've read a lot of the newer books. It's nice to have. I've actually been getting into collecting a lot of books that I've enjoyed as a kid through middle school and high school, and just the ones that have stuck with me, and this is definitely one of them. But if you haven't read this one, it's basically a semi-autobiographical story about his childhood in Ireland, and it's really just a journey from childhood to university to becoming an artist and becoming a novelist. And it has a lot of hope and positivity and a lot of lightness to it. And I think that's what really ended up sticking with me towards the end. And I feel like a lot of classics don't really have that feeling. So I got this next book about buddy old pal Franz Kafka because it just felt necessary. He's one of my favorite writers, and this book isn't just written like in the biographical sense, but it studies his life to try to get clues as to what informed his writing and his ideas and his philosophies, and just like stances on various social issues. This book also includes the letters that he wrote to his father, and if you know about those, I mean, It's a whole thing. But instead of recommending an obscure book that I found on Kafka, though, especially since I haven't read this one yet, I'll just say read Kafka. I'm recommending just like him as a blanket statement, I guess. And not to change the tone of the video to too serious, but maybe a little bit. 1984 by George Orwell. We all know what it's about. We know its significance. So I'm not going to say a lot further because I hope that that leaves a stronger impression by doing so. But read it if you haven't. If you have the means, buy a physical copy of this one, or better yet, keep an eye out when you see them at the thrift store or the used bookstores. That's all I'm going to say about this one. So I also found a couple of these Penguin Century Classic editions. We have A Gentleman Prefers Blondes by Anita Luce and A.E.W. Mason's The Four Feathers. I'll just share the quotes that were selected to, I guess, encapsulate the stories. And they convinced me to pick them up. Kissing your hand may make you feel very, very good, but a diamond and a sapphire bracelet last forever. And for The Four Feathers, a gripping tale of one man's struggle to erase the brand Coward from his name. There's just so many amazing stories in the Penguin Classics collection, and I always prefer to find them in this old format because I know that there's this really big box set, but to me that's so overwhelming and it kind of takes away from the joy of discovering the books one by one throughout time. That could just be me though. It might be actually, because I know that those box series are very popular right now, but I don't know, there's just something about reading those lines on the back and discovering a new classic author that you haven't heard of. It's just a unique feeling, I guess. Here's two shorter reads. We have In Our Time by Ernest Hemingway, and then Jock and His Master by Milan Kundera. With Kundera, I would say that he's more of a modern classic author, right? I'm not too sure though. But he's most likely the most well-known Czech writer. And if you're thinking, how can you forget that Kafka is the most well-known writer? I'd say technically, since Kafka wrote in German, he's not, but Kundera is also technically French. But aside from all that, I haven't read either of these specific works, and they're short reads. So if you find yourself where you want to be productive in your reading and be a little bit proud of yourself, maybe pick one of these up. If you've already read any of these two, please let me know your thoughts. I've also haven't read any reviews or done any research about these before filming. I just thought that the covers looked interesting, and I do like the authors. All right, so we're getting to the end of the list just about. I picked up The Gift by Vladimir Nabokov. It's a story of an impoverished poet that lives in Berlin, and he has this dream of writing a book one day, and it's the type of book that essentially is this book itself. So that premise is already intriguing enough for me. But from what I do know, it was his final novel, so it's kind of like a culmination of everything that he's learned in his craft. And I don't know if it's the best of his works to skip to after reading Lolita, but it's happening. This is the next one that I have. And we're closing off this haul, not with a classic this time, well, actually a modern classic, and that is Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides. From his works, I've only read Virgin Suicides, but I've heard a lot of great reviews over the years, and I finally got it. This is a novel that delves into identity and family and biology especially, and from what I do know about it, it's a work that's known to have been like a massive help and representation of intersex issues, and at least creating that dialogue on larger platforms. And at the end of the day, it's really a modern classic. It won a Pulitzer Prize of fiction. So this is one that I'm really curious about. It kind of veers into new thematic territory for me. And I know that I'll come out of it learning something new. Wow. So, okay, that was all 50 books, maybe 50 plus. I didn't count exactly. Are you still here? Don't lie. It's okay. That was a lot though. And I'm not going to be doing another haul in a very, very, very long time. I have more than enough, and I'm aware of that. So my goal is to stop going overboard, and I've actually already planned my next haul to kind of give myself something to look forward to, but also just for restraint reasons. But yeah, expect another book haul from me in June. My local library does this huge sale once a year where they just bring out all these rows of books, and everything's a quarter per book. And at that point, like, please, I beg of you, don't blame me if my next haul is like 50 hours long, because the way I see it, I'm basically saving money going to buy the books when they're also cheap, right? For real though, thank you for watching. And if you made it to the end of this video, comment a little bunny emoji. Not for any reason aside from the fact that I'm so excited about all the books, and it would make me really happy if you saw them all. The next video is not going to be this long, and I'll see you next week when that's posted.